My father-in-law demanded I have a grandchild or my husband would lose funding. Here is what happened when I refused. My name is Emily Thompson, and I want to share the complete and unabridged story of how my father-in-law tried to force me into having a child by using his money and influence as leverage. This is an expanded account containing all the details and experiences, meant to document each step of my long ordeal. I have chosen to write it in one piece, from my first-person perspective, without omitting the subtle nuances of emotion and conflict that shaped the final outcome. My father-in-law is Howard Phillips, my husband is Mark Phillips, my mother-in-law is Diane Phillips, and my brother-in-law is Andrew Phillips. My own parents are James and Laura Thompson. In order to respect the fullness of the story, I will include not only the central events themselves, but also the background that placed me and my husband in the path of Howard's manipulative ultimatum. I hope this account will stand as a warning that it is possible to preserve your self-respect even when faced with tremendous outside pressure over something as personal as your own body and the choice to have a child. I grew up in a modest home in a quiet Midwestern town. My parents, James and Laura Thompson, believed strongly in independence and honesty. They did not have much money, but they taught me that dignity and self-worth were more important than any sum of money. When I was in college, I traveled to the East Coast for my studies in art history, which is where I met Mark Phillips. At the time, he was focusing on mechanical engineering in grad school. Mark was kind, ambitious, and not afraid to speak his mind, though I would later learn that beneath his confidence lay a deep sense of obligation to his father, Howard Phillips, who was extremely wealthy and possessed a controlling streak. Mark did not talk much about Howard in the beginning. He rarely mentioned his father's business empire, saying only that his family had done well in real estate and finance. I did not probe. I assumed that Mark wanted to carve out his own path, separate from his father's shadow. We dated for about 2 years before marrying. During that period, I occasionally heard about Howard from Mark in passing, but I did not consider it a major concern. My focus was on building a future with Mark based on love, shared goals, and mutual respect. I believed we would be equals, deciding everything in partnership, including if and when to have children. After finishing grad school, Mark proposed. We married in a small ceremony, with just friends and a few relatives. Howard attended, but only for a short while. I recall him giving a toast in which he spoke about the importance of continuing the family line. He made references to how the Phillips name carried weight in certain circles, and how we, as a newlywed couple, should consider producing heirs. I found it odd to speak so directly about children at a wedding, but I decided to let it pass, attributing it to an older generation style. Mark and I began our new life in Boston, renting a modest apartment. He got a job at an engineering firm that paid decently. I found part-time work at a small art gallery while completing my own projects. We were not wealthy, but we managed. Howard would call occasionally, checking in on Mark, giving him advice about how to invest or what kind of connections to build. Mark politely listened but mostly made his own decisions. Our life was fairly stable. I did not sense any paternal demands about grandchildren for a while. Looking back, I think Howard was waiting to see if Mark would come asking for money or if Mark was going to try to succeed on his own. For roughly a year, we had no friction with him. That changed when Howard visited Boston and offered Mark a big opportunity to relocate near one of Howard's development sites in upstate New York. The plan was for Mark to manage a major project, with Howard backing him financially, promising a generous salary and a better standard of living. Mark was excited by the potential. I initially hesitated because I liked our small independent life, but Mark convinced me that it was best for his career. He said Father was proud of him. I recall telling Mark to be sure we would not be giving up our autonomy, that we could still do things on our own terms. Mark said Father had not mentioned children at all, so it should be fine. We moved to that region, letting Howard pay the bulk of the relocation costs, including a high-end condo. Mark's new position paid far more than his old job, with Father covering extra expenses, effectively letting us live in a style beyond our previous means. At the time, it felt like a blessing, though it gave Howard leverage. Howard would invite us to formal dinners at his estate, about a half-hour drive from our condo. Each time, he introduced Mark to local investors or powerful contacts, praising Mark as the rising star of the Phillips family. This environment was quite alien to me, used to simpler living. Meanwhile, father mostly stuck to business talk, though at the end of each dinner, he found a way to mention how wonderful it would be for Mark to produce an heir. The first couple times, I brushed it off, trying not to take offense, but eventually I told Mark that father was being pushy. Mark said father was just old-fashioned. I tried to remain polite, but in my mind, the repetition of these comments about grandchildren was starting to unsettle me. Over the next few months, Mark thrived in the new position, completing a big engineering project that saved father money. With the success, father decided to give Mark a bigger slice of the family business. He promoted Mark, raised his salary further, funded Mark's side ventures. We went from living comfortably to living lavishly, traveling for vacations, buying a second car, and occasionally flying my parents out to see us. I did not realize how dependent we had become on father, because it happened gradually. Mark was riding high, father was proud. Then father confronted me in private one evening, telling me that since Mark was now established, the next step was for me to have a grandchild. He made it sound like an instruction, stating that continuing the Phillips name was the real reason father had invested so heavily in Mark. I replied that Mark and I were not ready for children. Father gazed at me coldly and said that was not acceptable, that we had to fulfill our responsibility to the family line. I told him politely that my body was my own decision. Father told me that big money always carried conditions, and that I should think carefully if I wanted to remain in the family's good graces. I felt chills after that conversation. I told Mark about father's words. Mark was uneasy, admitting that father had started dropping hints in the office about it being time for me to conceive. We had a long talk. Mark tried to reassure me that father could not truly force us, though he did worry about losing father's support if we defied him. I told Mark I would not be coerced. Mark said he agreed in principle, but we needed to be tactful. For a time, father did not push too aggressively, but I sensed he was waiting for a certain moment to tighten the screws. Eventually, father decided to do exactly that. He invited Mark and me to a dinner at the estate, served by staff in a grand dining room. Diane, Mark's mother, sat quietly, barely meeting my gaze, as though she knew father was about to say something big. After the main course, father spoke bluntly. He said he had big plans to expand the family business and wanted Mark to head the expansion. But in return, father expected Mark and me to produce a child soon. Father stated that if we refused, he would withdraw all financial backing. I recall sitting there, stunned. Mark tried to defuse the tension with a joke, but father glared, telling Mark that if he would not have a baby, father considered him unworthy of leading the next generation of the business. Mark was too shocked to respond effectively. I told father I was not going to be blackmailed. That is when father hammered the ultimatum home. Either I become pregnant within a year or father cuts Mark off from the company and from any inheritance. Diane said nothing, staring at her plate. Mark asked father to calm down, father refused, and we left soon after. In the car, Mark and I fought. He wanted me to consider giving father what he wanted, since we had already considered having children eventually. I was livid that my own husband would contemplate caving to such an ultimatum. Mark argued that father was old, that maybe we should just do it. I said absolutely not under a threat. Mark apologized, saying he was just scared. That was the beginning of months of agony, with father pressuring Mark more each day, and Mark torn between his loyalty to me and the money father dangled. Father told Mark in the office that he was slashing Mark's budget for the next project unless we announced a pregnancy soon. Mark came home crestfallen, said father was not bluffing. Our finances started to slip as father withheld certain funds. People in the company gossiped that father and Mark had argued over personal matters. Mark asked me repeatedly, can we just do it, have a baby so that father will restore my position? I refused, saying father had no right to treat my womb as a commodity. Mark felt cornered and resentful. He told me I was risking our entire lifestyle. I retorted that I would not have a child for money. That was immoral. We had shouting matches. At times I cried, feeling that father was tearing us apart from a distance with his ultimatum. Mark would calm down, realize father was crossing a line, but the cycle would repeat whenever father turned the financial screws tighter. Eventually father declared that if I was not pregnant within a few months, Mark would be demoted to a minimal role, effectively humiliating him. Mark came home trembling, telling me father had set a specific deadline, that if we did not comply by that time, father would strip Mark of everything. Mark begged me to think about it. I felt ill. I asked Mark if he truly wanted to conceive a child under such threats, or if we both believed a child should be brought into the world with love. He said he wanted to be a father eventually, so maybe we were just moving the timeline forward. I felt outraged that this was not about timelines but about submission to father. Our fights escalated, stress took over our home, our love overshadowed by father's demands. True to his word, father soon canceled Mark's big projects. Our lavish life crumbled. We had to move out of the fancy condo father had arranged, because we could not afford the mortgage or rent on Mark's drastically reduced salary. I was forced to find a second job, tutoring students in art history, just to make ends meet. Mark grew depressed, sometimes blaming me for not giving in, other times cursing father for being so controlling. The tension was enormous. We ended up renting a small apartment with basic furniture, a big step down from the upscale lifestyle we had grown used to. I constantly reminded Mark that we had once lived modestly in Boston, that we could do it again, but Mark felt humiliated in front of acquaintances who had seen him as an heir apparent to a fortune. Howard Phillips, my father-in-law, told everyone in his circle that Mark had disrespected him, that we refused to cooperate with family traditions. Mark's older brother Andrew sided with father, though he did not take direct action. He told Mark he should just do what father wanted if he valued the inheritance. Mark refused, but was miserable. One night Mark lashed out, accusing me of dooming his career. I told him if he wanted to impregnate me for money, I would never forgive him. He broke down crying, apologizing, saying he was under unbelievable pressure. Our marriage wavered on the brink. Yet we kept talking, going in circles, me insisting that father had no right to blackmail us, Mark lamenting the lost wealth. As the months passed, father took the final step of rewriting his will, removing Mark from any major share. He made sure to note that if Mark produced a legitimate Phillips heir in father's lifetime, father might reverse that. Mark told me father had spelled it out: get pregnant or forget the inheritance. By this point, I had zero interest in pleasing father, but I feared the damage done to Mark's psyche. He was depressed, confiding in me that father considered him a failure. I told Mark I would rather fail in father's eyes than be used as a broodmare. Mark nodded, hugging me, saying he loved me more than father's money. We decided we would not cave. We struggled financially, me working multiple side gigs, Mark attempting to find independent investors for his engineering ideas. Father's shadow loomed large. Many potential backers were connected to father or did not want to cross him. Mark grew more bitter. We ended up fighting less but feeling a sense of despair. Our love for each other survived thanks to shared defiance. Ironically, we told ourselves we would outlast father's tyranny. Yet father was not the sort to relent. We heard from Andrew that father was furious, calling me the stumbling block, telling Mark that if he divorced me and found a more compliant wife, father might reconsider supporting him. Mark told Andrew that was never happening. Andrew just shrugged. Meanwhile, I tried to see if mother-in-law Diane could intervene, but she was powerless, overshadowed by father's dominance. Then father's health deteriorated. He ended up in the hospital with heart complications. Mark felt obligated to visit. I accompanied him. Father glared at me when we entered the room. He beckoned Mark closer, ignoring me. Mark tried to say we were sorry for his condition, but father cut him off, demanded that Mark reconsider. My husband answered that we refused to be blackmailed. Father turned to me, said I was a selfish woman who cost Mark everything. I told father I would never let him dictate how I used my body. Father coughed, told Mark to leave. That was the final time we spoke. Father fell unconscious soon after and never recovered. He died a couple weeks later, never reconciling with us. The funeral was lavish, with many business associates paying respects to the departed mogul. Mark and I stood apart from the main crowd, feeling unwelcome. People whispered that father had disowned Mark, that I was the reason. Andrew gave a eulogy praising father's achievements. I felt numb. It was a sad end to a man who once seemed unstoppable. After the funeral, the will was read. True to father's threat, Mark's share was almost nothing. Andrew got the bulk. I was not mentioned. In essence, father had cut us out of his estate. Mark took it stoically, though I saw tears in his eyes. He told me later that while he despised father's methods, he still grieved the permanent rift and the hope that father might have changed. We parted ways with the Phillips empire that day, free from father's demands but left with only our own resources to continue life. We moved to another city in the Midwest to escape the rumor mills. I found a job in a museum. Mark managed to connect with some startup folks who did not care about father's vendetta. Gradually, our finances improved. We rented a simple apartment, no luxury, but enough to feel secure. The years passed and we regained a sense of peace. The memory of father's ultimatum still haunted us, yet we found solace in each other. We had survived that terrible pressure without caving. Over time, Mark and I healed our relationship fully. We talked about children again. This time it was just for us, no father, no demands. Mark said he realized how destructive father's approach had been, that father should have let us decide freely. We decided to wait a bit longer, then eventually we tried, and I became pregnant. The joy we felt was genuine. We welcomed our son, naming him Daniel. It was a moment of pure happiness and none of father's money or conditions shaped it. We sometimes wondered if father would have loved Daniel, but it was too late. Father had passed away, sealed by his ultimatum. I occasionally pictured how father might have been as a supportive grandfather had he not wrapped everything in conditions, but that dream was never realized. Some acquaintances said we were foolish for letting father's money slip away. Others admired our courage. I do not see it as foolish or brave, merely as necessary. I refused to trade my body for a fortune. The mental anguish father caused was enormous, and the wedge he drove between Mark and me nearly broke our marriage. But in the end, Mark and I overcame his father's attempts. We carried on with dignity. Our child was born when and how we chose, not as part of a financial arrangement. I share the entire story so people understand the lengths to which a controlling figure might go to get a grandchild, even in modern times. My father-in-law literally said, "If you do not bear a grandchild soon, your husband gets no more funding. Either you have a baby on my schedule or you lose everything." That is how explicit it was. And I refused. Yes, we suffered in the short term. We lost the nice home, the fancy cars, the big bank accounts, the lavish opportunities. I do not regret it. Our marriage grew stronger once we removed father's power over our lives. Mark regrets the lost connection with father, but not the lost money. As for me, I am proud that we had a child only when it was right for us. That is the entire story from beginning to end, with all the swirling conflicts and heartbreak included. I have recounted how father repeatedly cornered us with demands, how Mark wavered, how we ended up losing everything financially but keeping our autonomy. I hope it demonstrates that no matter how wealthy or influential someone is, they cannot truly buy your decision on motherhood if you stand firm. If there is any moral, it is that sometimes letting go of a fortune is better than letting it rule you. My father-in-law tried to dictate my womb. I told him no. And while it cost us father's support and inheritance, it also freed us to make our own choices. Now we live a simpler life, far from father's domain, and we have our children on our own terms, free from a controlling father's ultimatum. That is the legacy we chose for ourselves, a legacy that places love and self-respect above wealth or outward success, and I do not regret it for a moment. Let this be a testament that if a father-in-law or anyone else demands you have a baby or face dire consequences, you can refuse. You might lose a fortune, but you keep your soul. For me, that is the final outcome, and looking at my son's face, I know we made the right choice. We live in a modest house, supported by Mark's honest work and my own career, raising our child in peace. My father-in-law could not see it, but a family built on genuine love is more valuable than any fortune gained through coercion. That is the story I share for others to read, an unvarnished account that spans our entire journey from the first sign of father's demands until we ultimately stood our ground.